9 secretaries. That was how many the Sicilian Mafia Boss had fired in less than a year. Some lasted days. One didn't even survive her first morning. So when a nervous, plus-size woman walked into his office, tripped over the Persian rug, spilled hot coffee across his desk, and scattered confidential files all over the marble floor, everyone smiled. Another secretary had just destroyed her career. The bodyguards stepped forward. The HR manager quietly reached for the termination papers. Then the woman suddenly froze. She stared at one document lying upside down on the floor, looked directly at the mafia boss, and whispered, "Sir, this signature isn't yours." For several long seconds, no one moved. The bodyguards stood frozen beside the massive oak desk. The HR manager slowly lowered the termination papers she had already prepared. Even the office seemed to stop breathing. The young woman remained kneeling on the marble floor, one hand still resting on the scattered documents. Her face burned with embarrassment after spilling coffee across the mafia boss's desk, yet her eyes never left the page she had just picked up. The Sicilian Mafia Boss rose from his chair for the first time that morning. His polished leather shoes echoed through the silent office as he approached her. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice calm enough to make everyone even more nervous. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry if I'm mistaken." She hesitated, clearly questioning whether she should continue. "But this signature doesn't match the others." One of the senior managers let out a sarcastic laugh. "You've been here less than 5 minutes, and you're already telling the boss what his own signature looks like." A few employees smirked, convinced this would be the final mistake. The boss ignored them. He took the document from her trembling hands and placed it beside another signed contract. His sharp eyes compared both signatures without saying a word. The room waited. Then his expression changed, almost imperceptibly. The first signature leaned slightly to the right. The second leaned left. The pressure of the pen was different. The final stroke ended too abruptly. Tiny details almost no one would ever notice. But they were there. The boss slowly lifted his eyes toward his legal advisor. "When did this contract arrive?" The man hesitated. "Yesterday, sir." "And who approved it before it reached my desk?" No one answered. The silence became heavier than the mistake everyone had been laughing at, only moments earlier. The boss looked back at the nervous secretary, who still seemed more afraid of ruining the carpet than of standing in front of the most feared man in Sicily. "You caused quite a mess on your first day," he said. She lowered her head. "I'm terribly sorry, sir." A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "But if you hadn't spilled that coffee, this forged contract would already have my approval." He turned toward the stunned HR manager. "Tear up those termination papers." "She's staying." For the first time since entering the building, the young woman looked up in disbelief. Around her, every employee who had expected another easy dismissal suddenly realized something far more dangerous. The mafia boss had just placed his trust in the one person everyone else had underestimated. By lunchtime, everyone in the headquarters had heard the story. The new secretary had somehow survived. Not because she was efficient, not because she was experienced, but because she had accidentally exposed a forged contract before it reached the mafia boss's signature. Most employees refused to call it skill. "Pure luck," they whispered. "It won't happen twice." Someone even started a betting pool. How long would she last? An hour? Until sunset? Or would she finally become the 10th secretary to lose her job before the week was over? The young woman knew nothing about the bets. She was too busy trying not to make another mistake. Unfortunately, that plan failed almost immediately. While organizing the boss's afternoon schedule, she accidentally dropped an expensive fountain pen onto the floor. It rolled beneath a cabinet. Flustered, she knelt to retrieve it. As she reached into the narrow space, her fingers brushed against a sealed envelope covered in dust. It clearly hadn't been touched in months. Thinking it had simply been misplaced, she handed it to the boss's assistant. "I found this under the cabinet." The assistant frowned. "That's impossible." He opened the envelope. Inside was an unsigned payment authorization that should have been processed weeks earlier. Without it, one of the boss's legitimate businesses had been paying unnecessary penalties every single day. The accounting department had been searching for the missing document for nearly a month. Silence spread across the office once again. Someone muttered, "How does she keep doing this?" The whispers grew louder. Luck. It had to be luck. The secretary wasn't any calmer the next morning. Trying to deliver a folder, she turned left instead of right and walked into the wrong conference room. The conversation inside stopped instantly. Several senior managers stared at her. I'm so sorry," she stammered, clutching the folder against her chest. "I think I'm in the wrong room." Before she could leave, her eyes landed on a presentation displayed across the large screen. A shipment schedule. She frowned. "Excuse me." Everyone looked at her with annoyance. She pointed timidly toward one line. "Shouldn't these 2 deliveries arrive on the same day? If they do, your warehouse won't have enough storage capacity." The room fell quiet. The logistics director hurried to review the numbers. 30 seconds later, his face turned pale. She was right. One scheduling error would have delayed millions of dollars worth of shipments. The mafia boss watched the entire exchange from the doorway without saying a word. For the second time in 2 days, the woman everyone called a walking disaster had prevented another costly mistake. He wasn't ready to call it talent, but it was becoming impossible to call it coincidence. By the end of her first week, the betting pool had disappeared. Not because people had stopped doubting her, but because no one could predict what would happen next. She still bumped into desks. She still carried too many folders at once. She still apologized so often that even the receptionists had begun finishing her sentences. Yet somehow, every mistake seemed to uncover something everyone else had overlooked. The Sicilian Mafia Boss said nothing. Instead, he watched. He had built an empire by trusting patterns instead of appearances. Coincidences happened once, sometimes twice, but not every single day. Late Friday evening, after most employees had gone home, he called the HR manager into his office. "I want her employment file." The manager looked surprised. "You think she lied on her resume? I think she left something out." Minutes later, a thin folder rested on his desk. There wasn't much inside. No prestigious recommendations, no recent executive experience, no impressive corporate titles. Only one position caught his attention: Senior Financial Auditor, 8 years earlier. At one of Italy's largest accounting firms, he raised an eyebrow. Why would someone with this background apply for an entry-level secretary position? The HR manager hesitated before answering. "We asked during the interview." And she said she had been away from her career for several years. The boss remained silent. There was more, the manager admitted quietly. Her father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. She resigned to become his full-time caregiver. For almost 6 years, the office fell silent. The boss continued reading. Medical expense records, letters confirming long-term family care, professional certifications that had quietly expired. One recommendation letter described her as a woman with an extraordinary ability to detect financial inconsistencies others routinely missed. Another praised her patience under pressure. Neither mentioned confidence. Neither mentioned leadership. The final page was handwritten. It wasn't part of her application. It looked more like a personal note, accidentally left inside the folder. "After so many years away, I don't know if anyone will ever trust me with responsibility again. I only hope someone will give me one chance." The boss read the sentence twice. Suddenly, The awkward woman who constantly dropped papers no longer looked careless. She looked out of practice. The following Monday morning confirmed his suspicion. She arrived nearly 40 minutes early. The office was still empty. Believing no one was watching, she sat alone at a small desk, with several accounting books borrowed from the company library. She carefully copied financial formulas into a worn notebook. When she made a mistake, she quietly erased it and started again, page after page, line after line, studying before work, trying to recover 6 lost years. She never noticed the mafia boss standing silently outside the glass door. He watched her close the notebook, straighten every pencil on the desk, and whisper to herself with a nervous smile, "Don't mess up today." For the first time since hiring her, he understood something everyone else had missed. She wasn't clumsy because she lacked intelligence. She was clumsy because she was terrified. Terrified of wasting the only second chance life had finally given her. And in his experience, people who fought that hard for one opportunity were often the ones worth trusting the most. The following week, something changed inside the headquarters. Not in the way people treated the new secretary. Most employees still expected her to fail. They still exchanged amused glances whenever she hurried through the corridors, carrying files that looked too heavy for her arms. But the mafia boss had stopped assigning her ordinary tasks. Instead, he began leaving complicated documents on the corner of her desk. No instructions, no explanations, just a simple note. Review before noon. She assumed he wanted them organized. Instead, she read every page, every number, every signature, every footnote. Hours later, she knocked softly on his office door. "You found something?" He hadn't even looked up from his desk. She nodded nervously. "I could be wrong, but the transportation costs in these quarterly reports increased almost 30%. The number looks reasonable at first. But when I compared the invoices, 3 different companies charged for the exact same shipment." The boss finally raised his eyes. "You're certain?" She placed 3 highlighted pages side by side. The dates overlap. The routes are identical. And the payment authorizations came from different departments. Someone duplicated the expenses. He studied the documents in silence. She was right. Again, a quiet internal investigation began that same afternoon. Within 2 days, an operations manager confessed to manipulating invoices through shell companies for years. Millions of euros had disappeared without anyone noticing. Word spread through the headquarters faster than anyone expected. Employees no longer laughed as confidently when the secretary walked by. Some even lowered their voices. Days later, another challenge arrived. This time, it involved an international partnership worth millions. Executives had already reviewed the contract. Lawyers had approved every clause. The boss handed the thick folder to his secretary almost absent-mindedly. One last review. She spent the entire evening reading it, long after the lights in most offices had been turned off. The next morning, she entered his office, carrying the contract covered with handwritten notes. "There is one paragraph that worries me." He leaned back in his chair. "Show me." She pointed to a single sentence hidden deep within the agreement. "It says your company assumes responsibility for all regulatory delays, even those caused by the other party. If customs holds the shipment, you still pay every penalty." He stared at the page. Then he called the legal department upstairs. Within minutes, 3 attorneys filled the office. None of them had noticed the clause. Not one. One of the senior lawyers slowly removed his glasses. "I've reviewed this contract 3 times. How did you find that?" The young secretary smiled awkwardly. "I used to spend entire days looking for small details. I suppose I never stopped seeing them." For the first time, the mafia boss allowed himself a genuine smile. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. but everyone in the room noticed it. Later that afternoon, he walked past her desk and quietly placed another stack of files beside her, larger than the last, more confidential. Without realizing it, the office witnessed something no secretary before her had ever earned. It wasn't admiration, not yet. It was something far more valuable, the complete trust of the most powerful man in the building. And although she still occasionally dropped a pen or apologized for speaking too softly, no one could deny the truth anymore. Whenever she focused on the work, she saw what everyone else missed. By the beginning of the third week, the atmosphere inside the headquarters had changed. People no longer laughed openly when the secretary walked through the halls. Instead, they watched her, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. But one person watched her with something far more dangerous: jealousy. Isabella Moretti, the company's executive director, had spent nearly 7 years earning the mafia boss's confidence. She was brilliant, elegant, always perfectly dressed. She had negotiated international contracts, handled political connections, and built a reputation as the most respected executive in the organization. Then, in less than 3 weeks, a nervous secretary had begun receiving confidential files before anyone else. Isabella couldn't understand it, and she refused to accept it. So when the weekly executive meeting began, she decided it was time to remind everyone exactly where the new secretary belonged. The conference room was filled with department heads, attorneys, financial advisors, and senior managers. The secretary entered quietly, carrying several folders the mafia boss had asked her to deliver. She intended to leave immediately. Instead, Isabella smiled. "Aren't you forgetting something?" The young woman stopped. "I'm sorry? If you're going to attend an executive meeting, at least wear a suit that fits." A few uncomfortable laughs echoed around the room. The secretary instinctively looked down at her oversized jacket. It had belonged to her late mother. She had altered it herself, because she couldn't yet afford professional business clothes. Isabella continued, "I've never seen anyone make oversized clothing look even larger." Another executive chuckled. Someone whispered, just loudly enough to be heard, "A walking disaster." The words hit harder than any accusation. The secretary's cheeks turned crimson. For a moment, she considered placing the folders on the table and walking out. Maybe everyone had been right from the beginning. Maybe she really didn't belong there. She lowered her eyes and quietly turned toward the door. "Stop." The mafia boss's voice filled the room. Everyone froze. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. He looked first at the secretary, then at every executive seated around the table. Finally, his eyes settled on Isabella. "Tell me, which person in this room discovered the forged contract?" No one answered. "Who uncovered the duplicated invoices?" Silence. "Who prevented us from signing a partnership that would have cost this company millions?" Again. No one spoke. The room suddenly felt much smaller. The boss slowly stood. "You laugh because she drops pens. You criticize her because she wears an old jacket. But every time she walks into a room, she notices the mistake the rest of you failed to see." His words landed with crushing weight. No one dared respond. The secretary remained standing near the door, unable to believe what she had just heard. For the first time in years, someone hadn't defended her out of pity. Someone had defended her because of her value. And although the meeting continued only moments later, nothing inside that room would ever be the same again. 3 days after the executive meeting, the headquarters prepared for its most important negotiation of the year. Representatives from a powerful European investment group were flying to Palermo to finalize a partnership worth hundreds of millions of euros. Every department had spent weeks preparing. Lawyers reviewed contracts. Financial advisors verified projections. Security teams inspected every detail. Failure was not an option. The mafia boss arrived precisely at 9. His executives followed. A few steps behind them walked his secretary, carrying the final presentation folders. As she entered the conference room, she noticed the familiar looks. Some people still questioned why she had been invited. She quietly placed the folders in front of each guest and stepped back without saying a word. The presentation began smoothly. For nearly an hour, every discussion went according to plan. Then the lead investor frowned. "I'm afraid we have a problem." The room fell silent. He projected a spreadsheet onto the large screen. "Your projected operating costs don't match the figures we received yesterday." The financial director quickly checked his documents. His face lost all color. 2 different versions of the same report had been sent. One showed projected profits. The other showed significant losses. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. "If these numbers are unreliable," one of them said calmly, "we may need to postpone today's signing." Weeks of negotiations were beginning to collapse. No one spoke. No one knew which report was correct. Then a quiet voice broke the silence. "Excuse me." Every head turned toward the secretary. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable interrupting senior executives. "I think I know what happened." The room waited. She walked to the screen, studying the spreadsheets for only a few seconds. The calculations aren't wrong. The versions were generated using different exchange rates. She pointed to a single figure. This report used last quarter's euro conversion. The other used this week's updated rate. She quickly recalculated the projections on a notepad. When the corrected figures appeared on the screen, both reports suddenly matched. The discrepancy disappeared. It hadn't been fraud. It hadn't been financial instability. It was a simple reporting error that no one had noticed. The investors looked at one another before slowly nodding. The tension inside the room dissolved almost instantly. One of the partners smiled. "Impressive. We were prepared to cancel the meeting." The mafia boss remained silent until every document had been signed. Only then did he stand. His gaze swept across the conference room before resting on his executives. "I want everyone here to remember something." He turned toward the young woman who was already trying to quietly gather the empty coffee cups. "Today, this agreement still exists because of her." No applause followed. None was necessary. The silence carried more weight than any celebration. For the first time since she had walked into the building, carrying an oversized briefcase and almost lost her job on her first morning, no one saw a clumsy secretary. They saw the woman who had saved the company once again. And for the first time, she began to believe she truly belonged there. The morning after the investment deal was signed, the atmosphere inside the headquarters felt strangely different. For the first time since she had arrived, people stopped staring at the secretary with amusement. Instead, they stepped aside when she walked through the hallway. Some greeted her politely, others simply nodded. It wasn't friendship, it was respect. The same employees who had once bet on how quickly she would be fired now watched every assignment she received from the mafia boss. The rumors spread through the building within hours. She saved another deal. The boss trusted her again. She spotted something the executives missed. Even Isabella Moretti had fallen unusually quiet. Late that afternoon, every department head received an unexpected message. Mandatory executive meeting. No explanation. When everyone gathered inside the conference room, the mafia boss entered carrying only a single folder. His secretary followed several steps behind, assuming she was simply there to take notes. She quietly sat in the corner. The boss looked around the room. "I have 2 announcements." The room became silent. The first. He placed several financial reports on the table. "The internal investigation is complete. The fraud involving duplicate invoices has been eliminated. The forged contract has been traced. And yesterday's investment agreement has officially been approved. A wave of relieved smiles spread across the room. Then he continued. The second announcement concerns the person responsible for preventing every one of those disasters. The secretary slowly looked up, confused. The boss opened the folder. Effective immediately. Miss Sophia Romano will no longer serve as my secretary. Several executives exchanged satisfied glances. For one brief moment, some believed she had finally been dismissed after all. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. Had she misunderstood everything? Had every success still not been enough? The boss closed the folder. She has accepted too much responsibility to remain in that position. A faint smile appeared on his face. From today forward, she is appointed Executive Operations Advisor. The room fell completely silent. Even Isabella looked stunned. The role had never existed before. The boss had created it. Specifically for her. He turned toward the executives. Any report involving finance, contracts, or operational risk reaches her desk before it reaches mine. No one argued. No one questioned the decision. Because every person in that room knew exactly why. The woman they had dismissed as a walking disaster had repeatedly protected the company from mistakes they themselves had overlooked. As the meeting ended, people slowly approached Sophia one by one. Some congratulated her, others awkwardly apologized. Even the executives who had laughed during her first week quietly admitted they had judged her too quickly. Finally, Isabella stopped beside her. For several uncomfortable seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Isabella extended her hand. I was wrong about you. You earned this. Sophia smiled gently before shaking her hand. Thank you. As everyone left the conference room, the mafia boss remained standing by the window, watching his employees interact with the woman they had once underestimated. The office had changed. Not because Sophia had become someone different, but because everyone else had finally learned to see what had been there from the very beginning. Her mistakes had always been visible. Her brilliance had simply taken longer for everyone else to notice. The headquarters slowly emptied as the sun disappeared behind the rooftops of Palermo. One by one, the lights on each floor went dark. For the first time in weeks, Sophia wasn't rushing to finish another report. She carefully organized the last folder on her desk, straightened the stack of pens she still had a habit of knocking over, and smiled quietly to herself. She had survived. More than that. She had found a place where she finally belonged. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed the mafia boss waiting beside the elevator, without his usual entourage, without bodyguards, just him. You work too late, he said. She laughed softly. I suppose I'm making up for the 6 years I lost. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The elevator doors opened, but neither stepped inside. Instead, they walked toward the building's front entrance together. The cool evening air carried the scent of rain. Sophia looked across the quiet street before breaking the silence. Can I ask you something? He nodded. Why did you keep giving me chances? I made mistakes every single day. I embarrassed myself. I almost ruined your office on my first morning. He smiled, a genuine smile she had never seen before. Everyone noticed your mistakes. He paused, looking at the city lights stretching across Palermo. I was the only one who paid attention to what happened after them. Sophia lowered her eyes. No one had ever described her that way. For years, people had remembered only the coffee she spilled, the papers she dropped, the awkward moments she wished she could erase. No one had ever noticed what she accomplished afterward. Until him. They reached the bottom of the marble steps outside the building. A black car waited nearby. The driver quietly opened the rear door. The mafia boss looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since the day they met, he didn't say, "Secretary." He smiled warmly and said, "Coming, Sophia." Hearing her own name spoken with such quiet respect brought tears to her eyes. She nodded. Together, they walked toward the waiting car, not as the feared mafia boss and his secretary, but as two people who had learned the same lesson. The world is quick to judge someone by their first mistake. The right person is the one who stays long enough to discover the strength hidden behind it. Sometimes, the greatest opportunities don't begin with a perfect first impression. They begin with someone who chooses to see your true worth when no one else will.